رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. آمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم. I welcome you back to our level 2 course in al Hadith, Ibn Hajar's Nukhbat al-Fikar, understanding core concepts in Hadith theory. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, today's lesson we cover a number of very important concepts within al Hadith. Of course, our overall course outcomes is towards understanding Hadith and its role in Islam, mastering standard Hadith terminology, and understanding Hadith preservation, transmission, as well as authentication bi-idhnillah. This lesson will cover Hadith classification in terms of comparison and contradictory evidence, Hadith classification in terms of acceptability and rejection of a Hadith, and synthesizing contradictory evidence. Hence, my reason for saying that this is an important lesson, bi-idhnillah. So, to date we've covered a variety of concepts as a form of revision. Let's briefly go through them, bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. We have looked at what is a hadith. We've given a brief introduction to the science as a whole. We've then looked at the origin story of the hadith concept, which is answering the questions of when, why, and how were a hadith transmitted, documented, and preserved. So that led us into a discussion on writing as a means of preservation, which of course took us to informal writing as an initial stage, and this then progressed all the way through to formal writing. In terms of formal writing, we looked at the various genres of hadith compilation, including the musannaf literature, the musnad literature, the sahih and sunan movement, as well as the methods and history of hadith criticism to verify important information and news. We then looked at the emergence of fabrication and the methods of our scholars to counteract that. And we've also analyzed the contemporary approach describing the same in terms of academic standards and how this compares to the classical approach. So what we are currently looking at is Shajaratu Tawdihiyya li Anwa' al-Hadith, a mind map essentially of the various categories of hadith classification. So if we analyze what we have in front of us here, then we can see we have been covering a number of topics. We've looked at this topic here, bihasbi turuqi or tariqati wusulihi ilayna, the method in which the ahadith had reached us, adadu turuqihi, in terms of the number of pathways. We've described a hadith mutawatir. We've looked at the concept of ahad and the various subcategories thereof. Today, we will look at the concept of bihasbi surat al-i'tibar, looking at comparative ahadith evidence. So, this discussion over here, which gives us two concepts, the mutabi' and the shahid. In terms of what comes next, we are also going to be looking at in this lesson bi'atibari al-amal bihi, considering when a hadith should be practiced upon and when not. So the categories of muhkam, mukhtaliful hadith, and the nasikh and the mansukh, which is ghayr ma'mulin bihi, that which you do not practice upon. So we will look at this entire section here in this lesson bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. We've also covered before other forms of accepted ahadith, your standard forms, which is your sahih li dhatihi, your sahih li ghayrihi, hasan li dhatihi, and hasan li ghayrihi. Of course, you can see that this is already a significant portion of what is to be covered. So if you circle this as well, we've covered that also. That means that which is not circled currently, we still have to unpack bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, and it is within our stride to do so. As we end this particular term, we look forward to a fruitful next semester wherein we will further analyze these concepts and add to the discussion on the contemporary matters bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So now to commence with Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's words, rahimahullahu ta'ala, قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا الله بعلومه وعلومكم آمين. He says, وزيادة راويهما. Now remember, we are speaking about the Sahih and Hasan Hadith still. This is a continuation from the previous text. He says, وَزِيَادَةُ رَاوِيهِمَا. The ziyada, additional information by rawihima, the narrators of the two of them, meaning the narrators of both the Sahih and Hasan category of Hadith. Their additional information is maqbulatun, it is accepted. So what is meant by additional information? So you have, for example, one chain of transmission with a number of narrators, transmitters, and they say that the Prophet ﷺ said, and they narrate their particular incident. You find a different chain also consisting of transmitters who are reliable, so thiqat, right? They are people of adala and people of dabt, right? Remember, those are the two key criteria for accepting a transmitter as being a thiqa, as being reliable. So if you have a different transmission, a different chain of transmission, but in this chain you have additional information. So for example, the one hadith would state, من كذب علي متعمدا فليتبوأ مقعده من النار. Another narration states, من كذب علي فليتبوأ مقعده من النار. So there's a difference between the one and the other. The one has an additional piece which says muta'ammidan, intentionally. So of course this is an important word because it alters the meaning of the narration. In the one narration, it is whoever lies upon the Prophet ﷺ should take their place in the hellfire. Then in the other narration it says whosoever lies upon the Prophet ﷺ intentionally should take their place in the hellfire. If you analyze both chains of transmission, now put aside the fact that this is a mutawatir narration for a second, because I'm just looking at the matan as an example. Generally speaking, we don't really speak about authenticity when it comes to a mutawatir transmission as a whole. But analyzing the individual chains, you may find one chain, an authentic or a reliable chain, meaning the chain is either hasan or it is sahih, whether lidhatihi or lighayrihi. Ideally lidhatihi. So you're dealing with a chain, it says A. You're dealing with another chain, it says a similar incident to the first chain, but there's an additional piece therein. It says muta'ammidan. If you exclude muta'ammidan, the hadith means even if you lie upon the Prophet ﷺ by mistake, you should take your place in the hellfire. Whereas the additional information means that if you lie about the Prophet ﷺ by mistake, then nothing will happen. Rather, only those who lie about the Prophet ﷺ intentionally. So do we accept this additional clause or don't we? Do we regard this additional clause as being part of the incident, or do we disregard it as a data entry point and we only look at the minimum, which is whosoever lies upon me should take their place in the hellfire? Now, based on the principle that Ibn Hajar is teaching us here, he says, وَزِيَادَةُ رَاوِيهِمَا. When you have a rawi of the nature of a Hasan Sahih hadith, so a thiqa rawi, then ziyadatu rawihima maqbulatun. Their transmission, even if they provide additional information compared to other transmitters, they would be regarded as acceptable. So those extra clauses, like intentionally, you would accept it because it comes from reliable transmitters as well. How do we explain this logically, that some transmitters have this additional clause while others do not? Well, there's a variety of ways that it could have transpired. So because this is a human endeavor and we are doing our utmost to decipher, where human error took place, is it possible that those, remember we are dealing with trustworthy narrators, so the people of adala as well as people of precision, but it's possible that some of them are transmitting by way of meaning, right? And they've omitted a particular word, while others may be transmitting literally what they heard. So verbatim what they've heard, they transmit that as is, and therefore there's this discrepancy. Another possibility is that when the one transmission was quoted by the last narrator or by one of the transmitters, that it was quoted for a specific purpose, So he only quotes part of the hadith as opposed to quoting the whole hadith. Now, the bottom line is, for as long as the transmitters in question are people of adala, integrity, and dabt, right, precision, whether that be tamud dabt or khafiful dabt, generally speaking, for as long as they don't contradict transmitters who are more reliable than they are, you would accept their additional information. And that's key. If they contradict those who are more reliable, more trustworthy than they are, more precise than they are, then we may end up in a different issue, which is what we're going to be unpacking here, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So he says, it would be accepted, مَا لَمْ تَقَعْ مُنَافِيَةً لِمَنْ هُوَ أَوْثَقُ مِنْهُ, which is exactly what I just stated now. For as long as, مَا لَمْ, for as long as not تَقَعْ, there has not occurred, munafiyatan, any contradictory information, liman huwa awthaqu minhu, from more reliable transmitters. So if you have a chain of transmitters that produces information that's additional to a different chain, but the other chain that does not produce that information, they are far more reliable, they are far more precise than the initial chain, then you will not accept that additional information, because now, even though they are reliable, they've contradicted those who are more reliable than they are, in which case you have a new scenario coming up, which is what we're dealing with now. فَإِنْ خُولِفَ بِأَرْجَحٍ, so if your additional information, if the contradiction is differed by those who are more reliable, فَالرَّاجِحُ, then in that case, so you're now sitting with contradictory evidence, right? The first narration says ABC, the second transmission says ABCD, so there's an addition of D. But in this instance, those who transmit ABCD, they are less reliable than those who transmit ABC. So who do you accept? You accept those who are more reliable, so you reject the additional information. So in this case, the more reliable transmission is going to be considered the rajih, the preponderant one, and it is going to be called al-mahfudh, right, which means preserved. And وَمُقَابِلُهُ, that which contradicts it, right, remember they are contradicting those who are more reliable than them. So this side will be referred to as shadh, right, which you can translate as anomalous. وَمَعَ الضَّعْفِ, and when there's a similar type of contradiction between authentic and unreliable transmitters, then we no longer call it mahfudh and shadh. Now we refer to it as فَالرَّاجِحُ, the preponderant one, the more reliable one is al-ma'ruf. It is considered ma'ruf, which literally means well-known or good. But these are technical terms, so we don't use the literal translation always, right? وَمُقَابِلُهُ, and the weak transmission that contradicted it is going to be considered al-munkar. It's going to be considered munkar, which literally means strange, right? Or absurd. But again, it is not something that the literal translation would suffice for. So that is a lot of information contained in about 3 lines of text. Let us unpack that so we can understand it more holistically, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So as I stated before, you have imagine this to be one chain of transmission, and this is another chain of transmission. So this is one isnad and this is another isnad. Both asanid, both chains of transmission, the one on this side as well as on the one on this side, they are from authentic or reliable transmitters. Okay, so you're dealing with only reliable transmissions here, right? You would grade the individual chain as being either sahih or hasan, right? However, based on the nature of the transmitters, the chain that says awthaq over here, let me name them. So this is chain A, is going to be awthaq, which means more reliable than chain B, which is thiqah. Okay, and this is a overall declaration of judgment on that particular chain. However, if you are presented with an instance where there is ziyadatu thiqah, so you have an instance where there's additional information by a reliable transmitter. Thiqah means a reliable transmitter. Then when this is in contradiction, not when they can be synthesized. If they can be synthesized, there's no issue. But when there's a contradiction between that which is more reliable, chain A, to that which is less reliable but still reliable, chain B, then we refer to chain A as mahfudh, and you refer to chain B as shadh. So mahfudh is an authentic transmission that has a contradiction with another, but it is more reliable. So it's mahfudh. Shadh is a term that refers to a chain of transmission that is reliable, but it is contradictory to that which is more reliable, and therefore we refer to it as shadh. Now, of course, you can only pick up such a difference when comparing chains of transmission. So as a student or as a talib, you assess a particular sanad and you come to discover that if I look at every single transmitter in this chain, I find that is thiqa, 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 thiqa. So the entire chain has thiqat, right? Reliable transmitters. There's no inqita', there's no missing links in the sanad. My first part of my hadith sahih has been sorted. Remember, because hadith sahih is that which is transmitted by عدل تام الضبط عن مثله إلى منتهى السند من غير معلن ولا شاذ. So if you have that in one chain, then it's a reliable chain. But the second part of the definition says من غير معلن ولا شاذ. So by comparing the chains of transmission, you come to discover that, hold on, there's actually additional information here. There's a ziyada here. In other words, there's a contradictory evidence, and one chain is more reliable than the other. There's another chain A, that's more reliable than the chain we are dealing with, which is chain B. So even though chain B, without looking at any other evidence, would be considered as authentic, because chain A exists and it is more reliable, therefore it is no longer going to be considered as authentic, because there's the presence of shadh. It is a contradiction to that which is more reliable than it. So that was the first part of what Ibn Hajar mentioned. And then the second part was a similar scenario, extremely similar, in that you have two chains of transmission. One contradicts the other. The difference this time being that it is not a contradiction between a reliable chain and a more reliable chain, but rather between an unreliable chain and a reliable chain. So looking at our example here, or at the grammatical representation, did I say grammatical? I meant diagrammatical representation. So you have, once again, A and B. In this case, A, the transmitters are thiqat, right? So they are trustworthy and reliable transmitters. Chain B is da'if. So it does not meet the requirements of Sahih, nor does it meet the requirements of Hasan, right? For Sahih, the transmitters had to be people of Adala and people of Dabt. For Hasan, they had to be people of Adala and at least Khafif al-Dabt, right? A lighter form of precision. If they don't meet those requirements, either they lack Adala or they lack Dabt entirely, then that chain is going to be considered da'if at least, right? It's going to be considered weak. We'll get to the reasons for why a chain is weak in future lessons. However, because you're sitting with additional information, you're sitting with a ziyada of a thiqa on this side, right? You're sitting with a ziyada, the additional information by a thiqa on this side. This is now going to be graded as ma'roof, okay? Because it's a thiqa. So the end result is that the reliable chain is going to be considered ma'roof, while the unreliable chain that contradicts a reliable chain is no longer just going to be da'if. It's now going to go to a worse state, which is munkar. When a hadith is da'if, right, it means that it is weak. It means that it is unreliable. It also means that it cannot be utilized for the creation of Islamic law. Right? It won't be relied upon to formulate ahkam, right? To derive the ahkam, the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, if a hadith is da'if, there's still use for it. There is still use for it. We'll come to learn later on in the text what a da'if, a weak hadith can still be used for. Because when a hadith is declared as being da'if, it is not the same as saying that the hadith is fabricated or that it is a lie. It is simply saying that as far as the evidence is concerned, the probability of this being the words of the Prophet ﷺ is less than 50%. That's essentially what it is saying. That there's a lesser chance that he said this sallallahu alaihi wasallam than what there is that he did not say this, if I got that correct. There's a greater chance that he didn't say this than there is that he did say it. Okay, so that's da'if. So there's a place for it, right? For example, virtues, right? Praiseworthy acts within Islam. If there's any virtues attached to it and it comes from a weak hadith, those will still be considered for history, for tafsir. So there's a paradigm for it with certain conditions. However, if that weak hadith is found to be contradictory to that which is authentic, then the hadith is considered munkar and no longer da'if. And what is munkar? Munkar means, basically for our purposes here, it basically means very weak, right? So this is very weak. It's da'if plus, right? It's an upgrade from da'if. And now you can no longer utilize it as you would have been able to before. Why? Because while da'if or weak ahadith has a place, very weak ahadith is like fabrications. There's no place for it except to clarify that it is very weak or to clarify that it is in fact a fabrication. Now, there are many examples of this, but I thought of one example that's a bit interesting because of the differences of opinion around it. So, the interesting bit is that in the month of Ramadan, there's a well-known or oft-quoted hadith that states that the first of Ramadan, أوله رحمة وأوسطه مغفرة وآخره عتق من النار. And the hadith in and of itself, according to the majority of muhaddithun, remember there's not always clear-cut agreement on which ahadith are authentic and which are not. Generally they agree most of the time, but they often disagree on the status of a particular hadith. So most of the muhaddithun regard this hadith about Ramadan and the virtues of the month as being weak. Now, if it is only weak, then we can still utilize the hadith for fadailul a'mal. So basically to encourage the good deeds of striving for rahmah and striving for maghfirah and striving for salvation from the fire of Jahannam. But some scholars were of the opinion that it contradicts ahadith which are more authentic. Right? It contradicts ahadith which are authentic. And that being the ahadith that demonstrates that the entire month is for mercy and the entire month is for forgiveness and the entire month is for salvation from the fire. Another part of the hadith states that a fard act of worship gets the reward of 70 times a fard act of worship, while a sunnah act of worship gets the reward of a fard act of worship. I think it's from the same transmission. Now this seemingly contradicts other ahadith in which the Prophet ﷺ says to us that Allah Azza wa Jal has not informed us of the reward for fasting. That كُلُّ عَمَلِ بِنِ آدَمَ لَهُ إِلَّا الصِّيَامَ فَإِنَّهُ لِي وَأَنَا أَجْزِي بِهِ. All the actions of the son of Adam is for him except for fasting. Fasting is for me and I will reward for it. So some scholars were of the opinion, I forget exactly who, it's been a while since I read that issue and the example only came to me as I was dealing with this. Some scholars regard this as being not just weak, but as being munkar because of this phenomenon. Now, it is not a ruling that you should take as absolute and you can no longer use the hadith because there's a difference of opinion about it. My point is just to demonstrate how this exactly works. So a hadith that is initially weak could be discovered later when compared to other ahadith that in fact it's not just weak because it's contradicting more reliable or reliable evidence, then it is no longer just weak, it is now upgraded to more weak or severely weak, which is in this instance called munkar. Now, it's not always that a hadith is going to be called munkar when it is very weak. It sometimes may just be called da'if jiddan. Munkar is a specific type of very weak, which is a weak hadith that contradicts that which is authentic. So that is exactly what we are demonstrating in this diagram. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. For another grammatical, or I said it again, for another diagram representation of this, we can look at the following. So there's some chains of transmission here. We have on this side We have sahih. This chain of transmission is sahih. Forget the word shadh at the top for a moment. This chain is sahih, meaning you have adala dabt, okay, that's a sahabi, right? And the Prophet ﷺ. So the hadith is sahih. This hadith is asah. It is more reliable. So you have adala and dabt, but to a greater degree than on this side, right? On the other side. So this is sahih plus. It is asah minhu. It is more authentic. In this instance, if there's a contradiction between the two, then that which is more reliable, this one over here, is going to be called mahfuz, and that which is less reliable, because it contradicts that which is more reliable, it's now going to be called shadh. And shadh is another category of very weak. Okay, so you can end up with a sahih hadith, or rather you can begin with a sahih hadith and it ends up becoming very weak, meaning shadh, which is technically very weak. And this is demonstrative of the fact that our scholars were not only focused on the isnad itself. Had it been that hadith criticism was only focused on the isnad, then a concept like shadh would not exist, because shadh is not strictly an isnad concept. It is an isnad cum matan analysis of the hadith. You first look at the isnad and you arrive at a ruling, but the ruling can be overruled because of its comparison with another hadith, and there we look at both the isnad and the matan. Why? Because now we have to check the reliability of the transmitters, that comes from the isnad, and we have to check the content of the matan, which is content criticism. So there are many contemporary arguments, often from the Orientalists, that Islam's form of hadith criticism is somewhat lacking because it does not take into consideration matan criticism. Now, there's a long academic discussion about this that we cannot really afford to get into right now, because it will detract from the lesson that you are busy with. But it's important that I just bring your attention to it. So should you come across the discussion about content criticism, right? You can do research on this matter. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that when you do come across this, you have also heard about it from the traditional perspective, that content criticism was definitely a consideration, but it's far preceded by isnad criticism, which is the essence of hadith criticism in Islam. Another important concept to note is that when you have shadh, when you have a authentic transmission that you end up discovering is actually contradictory to that which is more authentic, it means that the chain of transmission that appears to be authentic, right, is actually problematic. That something took place in there, that something took place in the chain of transmission that made it problematic. We don't know exactly what, but we've now found by way of evidence that there is a problem. So through comparison with other asanid, with other chains of transmission, our scholars were able to pinpoint exactly when problems took place, even when they were hidden behind an apparently authentic chain of transmission. And that's a very important point to understand, that it's not just a superficial exercise of checking a bunch of names and checking what others had said about them and then just going with whatever we end up with, but rather there is a more delicate and more intricate process that is a very sophisticated process actually, which we'll elaborate more on as we proceed. Then of course, as we said, if you have a weak transmission, in this case, this chain here, 1 to 1 to A to the Prophet ﷺ, this chain is da'if, because you discover that either this transmitter over here or this transmitter over here is actually lacking the qualities of either adala or dabt, to the point that we can no longer grade the hadith as sahih, no hasan, but da'if. Then on this side you have an authentic or reliable transmission. So it's either hasan, in this case it's hasan, or it is sahih. So when you have a da'if going against a hasan, then if there's a contradiction here, it's an easier matter to deal with, because you wouldn't really give much consideration to the da'if hadith. But let's say you did consider the da'if hadith because of a specific use case, right? The virtue of deeds. But then you discover that it contradicts something that is actually authentic or reliable, right? Something that is hasan or sahih. Then in that case, it's no longer just da'if, it is now munkar, right? Which is very weak, and that which is authentic is going to be called ma'ruf. So these terms, munkar, ma'ruf, mahfud, and shadh, they work in a similar way, and they deal with contradictions and contradictions between ahadith of different grades of authenticity. That's the essence of what we are dealing with here, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So, moving on to the next slide, we see now that Ibn Hajar adds to this conversation, and he says, وَالْفَرْدُ النِّسْبِي, that the fard, the individual transmission, right? Remember when we dealt with mutawatir and ahad, then under ahad we had mashhur, aziz, and gharib. And under gharib you had gharib mutlaq and gharib nisbi. So gharib mutlaq was when you have a point in the chain of transmission where there's only one transmitter, and that's the only transmission that you have. Whereas gharib nisbi is you have other transmissions, but in this one particular chain you have a case of only one transmitter at one particular level. That's the essence of the difference between the two that we dealt with earlier. Now he's commenting on this and he says, وَالْفَرْدُ النِّسْبِ, that type of individual transmission, in وافقه غيره, if it is supported or if it is in conformity with another chain of transmission, فهو المتابع, then you call that individual chain supportive evidence with a specific name, mutabi', right? The plural mutaba'at, right? Mutabi' is a supportive chain of transmission. وَإِن وُجِدَ مَتْنٌ يُشْبِهُهُ فَهُوَ الشَّاهِدُ. If you have chains of transmission and you find that there's another matan, there's another incident that is reported from the Prophet ﷺ that seems to be similar to the one that you have, but it's a completely different chain. So you perhaps had 2 or 3 Sahaba transmitting from the Prophet ﷺ to different tabi'een, to different atba'u tabi'een, and so forth. Now you sitting with one hadith, let's say it is the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala an, and you're dealing with that sanad, but it is an individual chain, and then you're dealing with another one as an individual chain. But the two mutun, the two incidents appear to be reflecting the same. Let's say it's both talking about an incident during the Hajj of the Prophet ﷺ when he did a particular thing. And even though they both report the same incidents, it's coming through different chains of transmission. Now, because you have a completely different matan that seems to support the matan you are trying to assess, this is also supportive evidence, but it is supportive evidence with a different name, and that is ash-shahid, right? Which is literally a witness, but again, the literal translation doesn't do justice here. It is supportive evidence of this nature. The process of comparing asanid, as we are seeing now, this process is called وَتَتَبُّعُ الطُّرُقِ, pursuing various chains of transmission, لِذَلِكَ, for this purpose, comparative isnad study, هو الْإِعْتِبَار, you refer to this process as al-i'tibar, right? I'tibar is basically consideration or study, but it is the specific process of comparing chains of transmission to find supportive evidence. In practice, the way one would deal with this as a scholar of Islam is you find a particular transmission, whether this comes from a hadith book or whichever source, but you find a hadith. Now you want to assess what is the hukm of this hadith. Is this hadith reliable? Is it sahih? Is it hasan? Is it da'if? What's the ruling of this hadith? The first job that the scholar would have to do is to make takhrij of the hadith, meaning they would have to source the hadith from its primary sources. So for example, if you find a hadith in the Ihya Ulumuddin of Imam al-Ghazali, or you find a hadith in, let's say, a tafsir book, right? Tafsir of Imam al-Tabari. So there's the hadith, You want to find a particular ruling on the hadith. Can I rely on this hadith or can't I? The first job is to make takhrij. What is it? Or what is takhrij? Takhrij is to find the primary sources of this particular hadith. Chances are the hadith appears in more than one source most of the time. So you would have to pursue all of the books of hadith. Now, of course, today we use search engines and the like, and the job is so much easier. But in the past, you would use an index, right? A hadith index book, which is also an encyclopedic work, where you can find the matan of your particular transmission alphabetically. And then once you find the matan, the Prophet ﷺ said, and then the matan would come, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. So you go and look for إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ alphabetically as you would look for a word in the dictionary. When you find that matan, it would then give you all of the various primary sources of that hadith. What's a primary source? A primary source is a book that gives you the asanid as well, right? It is a hadith book, number one, and it is a full hadith book in that it gives you the asanid. So not like Riyadh al-Salihin or al-Mishkat, because there you just have the mutun. But a primary source would be the Sihah Sitta, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, etc., or Bayhaqi, or one of the other primary sources. Once you find all of the different transmissions of that hadith, now the scholar would put those transmissions together by checking to see, are all of these from the same sanad, from the same sahabi? So you trace the hadith. The Prophet ﷺ, does he transmit to only one sahabi, or are there more than one who transmit this from him? And so you follow the chain of transmission. Now you're sitting with, in some instances, many chains of transmission that either meet up or they don't meet up. If they don't meet up at all, then you're sitting with a shahid, right? Because these are different mutun, these are different incidences that appear to be referring to the same thing. So these are shahid. Each one is going to be a shahid. But if they meet up, right? If they meet up and you have one supporting the other, in the sense that you have a chain over here and you have a chain over here, and they link up at a particular point. So either they link up at the point of the tabi'i or the follower of the tabi'i, or even at the further down, then that would be referred to as a mutabi'. And to demonstrate this again in terms of a diagram, let's look at the screen in front of us. So the process is referred to as i'tibar, comparative hadith evidence. When you're sitting with one matan, so this is the words of the Prophet ﷺ here, then you have the sahabi over here, and then you have a transmitter from the sahabi, and then you have one chain going down here from him and one chain going down here. And you are trying to assess, say, what X is. Is X reliable or not? So perhaps X is Hasan, right? Hasan li dhatihi. But then you come to discover that this chain over here is also Hasan li dhatihi. So number one over here was Khafiful Dabt, and number two over here is Khafiful Dabt, and you just need the one to support the other. So these are supportive evidences of one another, and this would be a reason to take this hadith from Hasan li dhatihi to Sahih li ghayrihi, which is exactly what we've been demonstrating so far. So this is how you can ramp up the authenticity of a hadith based on supportive evidence. But the job that we have here is to understand the difference between a mutabi', right? A supportive evidence that is basically a branch of the hadith. This is the hadith, the whole thing is the hadith. And then the branch is supportive of another branch that is mutabi'. On the other side here, you have one hadith. It's exactly the same as what we saw here, right? But you have another chain entirely from a different sahabi, from a different narrator from the sahabi all the way down. It's not a branch of the same chain. It's a new chain entirely, right? And this is what Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani was referring to here as a separate matan, yushahiduhu or yushabihuhu, that is similar to the other one. So they both are speaking about the same incident. This is a different type of evidence, considered often to be a sort of a stronger supportive evidence, though in practical terms it ends up as the same thing. So if this chain, for example, was da'if, right, it's weak, and this chain on this side is also weak, obviously for different reasons because it's different chains, then this weak chain of B and this weak chain of A will lend support to one another, and you may have a Hasan li ghayrihi hadith. Okay? Now, again, this is why it's so important to keep up with the terminology. The previous lesson, we discussed Hasan li ghayrihi and we defined it. In this lesson, I'm using it as though you've already mastered it. And that is the expectation, right? That by the next lesson, you have basically memorized and mastered what we've discussed in the previous lesson. Otherwise, you can see now it will become very complicated. I will not use the definition of Hasan li ghayrihi and Sahih and so forth every single time. I'll just use the term. And the same thing applies to this here. I'm now going to use, you find a mutabi' or you find a shahid, right? If you make i'tibar, these are terms that the scholars of hadith use, and this is why it's important to study ulum al-hadith or mustalah al-hadith so that you are familiar with the terminology and thus you are able to understand the conversation of the muhaddithun. So that was comparative evidence. Now we move on to the next element mentioned in the Nukhba. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani mentions, rahimahullah ta'ala, ثُمَّ الْمَقْبُولُ. Then in terms of accepted transmissions. Now we've already started discussing accepted transmissions. Hasan, rather Sahih is accepted. Sahih li dhatihi is accepted. Sahih li ghayrihi is accepted. Hasan li dhatihi is accepted. Hasan li ghayrihi is accepted. Those are all accepted forms of transmission. But to add to other forms of transmission that are also accepted, however, there is some consideration therein. Therefore, it forms part of a subcategory as well. So let's look at that. In salima, if it is safe, min al-mu'aradati, from any form of contradiction, فهو المحكم, then you refer to that as definitive. It is muhkam, right? There's no problem with it. Then it's basically just as these. Most of the hadith is of this category. This isn't a special category really. It just refers to a hadith, whether that's Hasan or Sahih. There's no contradiction for it, and therefore you can just consider it as it is, as muhkam. It's applicable. You can practice on it. A ruling can be derived from it, and therefore muhkam from the word hukam. You can actually derive law from it as is. But when there are contradictions, you first have to resolve the contradictions before you can apply the hadith, or before you can derive a ruling from the hadith. And therefore, he continues and he says, وَإِنْ عُورِضَ, if it is contradicted, بِمِثْلِهِ. بِمِثْلِهِ meaning with another evidence of the same strength. Of the same strength is important because what we've done before this was a contradiction with different strengths, either authentic and more authentic, or weak and authentic, right? Those were different strengths. But if there's a contradiction within a hadith, and the contradiction comes from a hadith with the same strength, you have Hasan and a Hasan, or you have a Sahih and a Sahih. There's no clear line of this one is more reliable than that one. What do you do then? وَإِنْ عُورِضَ بِمِثْلِهِ, if it is contradicted with a similar strength evidence, فَإِنْ أَمْكَنَ الْجَمْعِ, if it is possible, then al-jam'u, you should synthesize between them. You should synthesize between them. What is synthesis? Basically to make everything work coherently without rejecting or taking away anything at all. So, jam' is the first step. We will look at this again, inshallah ta'ala, as we proceed. This you would refer to as فَهُوَ مُخْتَلِفُ الْحَدِيث. You would refer to it as مُخْتَلِفُ الْحَدِيث, which literally means a hadith that has been differed about. But all you are really saying is that you have two transmissions of equal strength or of similar strength. The one is contradicting the other, but you've made jam' between them so the hadith works, right? So there's some ikhtilaf, happening there, but it's synthesized, so it's still applicable. You refer to this as mukhtalif al-hadith, and there's a separate, it's an entire genre of hadith sciences as well, which you will see in a bit, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So that's the first example of when it's not muhkam, but there's some contradiction and we need to deal with it. The first step is to make jam', and when you can make jam', when you can synthesize between them, you then refer to the result as mukhtalif al-hadith. The next form, أو ثبت المتأخر. If you cannot make jam', if you cannot synthesize between the transmissions, if they are absolutely contradictory, like there's no possible way that you can make both work or make all of them work simultaneously because it's a real contradiction, then it might be possible to have أو ثبت المتأخر. You can have an established date that the one came later than the other, that the one transmission or the one incident happened later than the other incident. So this is an establishment of dates, an establishment of chronology. فهو الناسخ. Then the one that came later, the final word, in other words, the final action, the final statement of the Prophet ﷺ, that there would be referred to as the nasikh, the abrogator, wal-akharu, and the other, meaning the one that preceded it, the one that came earlier, the previous statement of the Prophet ﷺ, that would be referred to as al-mansukhu, which is the abrogated. Okay? وَإِلَّا, but if you cannot synthesize on the basis of abrogation, on the basis of dates, if you don't have evidence that the one incident took place later than the other, you can't just make this stuff up, you must have evidence for it. But if you don't have that ability, then the next step in synthesizing would be فَالتَّرْجِيحُ, then preponderance, where even though this hadith is valid and this hadith is valid, they're both reliable, they are contradictory, we cannot synthesize between them, we cannot determine which one came later or earlier, we don't have sufficient evidence, the next step in synthesizing would be to give preference to the one transmission over the other transmission, but that too needs to be based on evidence. And the reasons for why a scholar would prefer one over the other are abundant. There are many, many reasons. Some scholars mention over 50 reasons for why you would prefer one transmission over the other. We're not going to get into that. It's more a discussion in later or more advanced ulum al-hadith discussions, and it's also overlapping with usul al-fiqh as well. So that's tarjih. And then if you cannot even do that, if it is impossible for the scholar to prefer one transmission over the other transmission, and this is nadir jiddan, if it ever occurs, I don't have an immediate example on mind, but if it does occur where they cannot give preference, they've tried all the other means, then they end up making ثُمَّ التَّوَقُّفُ, then they pause, a conscientious pause to not act on either of the transmissions until further evidence is manifest. So let's look at this in a diagram again. So what we are dealing with here is a categorization بحسب القبول والرد, in terms of acceptability or rejection of a hadith. Some ahadith are going to be maqbulun, accepted, and other ahadith are going to be mardudun, rejected. Now we have not covered the reasons for why a hadith should be rejected, except to mention it here and there, like in the case of shadh and mu'al and people being da'if. But we haven't dealt with the specifics. Maqbul or accepted transmissions, on the other hand, we have dealt with a significant number of these already. So we've said if a hadith has no issue with it whatsoever, there's no contradictions, then you refer to the hadith as being al-muhkam. Now generally you would find some books of ulum al-hadith adding the categories of hasan, sahih, sahih lidhatihi lighayrihi, hasan lidhatihi lighayrihi. You would find them adding this sort of separately. But technically speaking, they fall part of the muhkam category because they are muhkam, right? If it's just hasan, if it's just sahih, whether lidhatihi or lighayrihi, and there's no contradictions, then you refer to that as muhkam. So it's technically a subcategory of muhkam, even though it can be placed elsewhere, as you will see in the other mind map, inshallah ta'ala. So that's muhkam, and that's most of the hadith. If there is a contradiction with other ahadith though, okay, now we've dealt with when they are of different strengths, there it's shadh and mahfuz, or munkar and ma'ruf. But here we are talking about contradictions within a hadith of similar authenticity statuses. So that would be referred to as mukhtaliful hadith. When is it referred to as mukhtaliful hadith? When you follow the procedure that you will see in a moment, which is essentially jam', and if you can manage to make jam' or synthesize between them, that's when it refers to mukhtaliful hadith. If you cannot do that, so let me just clarify something here. If it is possible to make jam', then it is mukhtaliful hadith. If it is not possible to make jam', then you go on to the next step, which forms here, and that is naskh, right? Naskh can only take place when you have established dates, which would result in you having a nasikh and a mansukh, an abrogator and an abrogated. And if you cannot do that, then you follow the rest of the procedures as mentioned here, tarjih and tawaqquf. Let's look at it from this perspective here. Al-muhkam wal-mukhtalif wa mukhtalif al-hadith. Muhkam, definitive or final, and mukhtalif al-hadith, disputed but sorted. Disputed but sorted. That may be a good way of thinking about it. Let's look at it. Al-muhkam, linguistically it means that which is firm. Technically it means the acceptable hadith that is not contradicted by anything of a similar type. Most ahadith are of this kind. Mukhtalif hadith, mukhtalif al-hadith is the acceptable hadith. It is acceptable. That has another hadith which contradicts it, although it is possible to reconcile them. I think I will just add in here, they are of similar strengths. If they were not of similar strengths, then the earlier discussion of an authentic hadith contradicting a more reliable hadith, or weak hadith contradicting a reliable hadith, those terminologies would be applied. But here with mukhtalif al-hadith, we are talking about a hadith of similar strength. It is the acceptable hadith that has another hadith which contradicts it, but you should add in there of similar strength. So let me add it in, bi'idhnillah ta'ala. Of similar strength. Okay? Although it is possible to reconcile them, and that's also key. What is to be done if two acceptable hadith are contradictory? The following. If there is an apparent contradiction, the first step in reconciling that is jam' or reconciliation, which is to act upon both a hadith and reconcile the apparent contradiction. Mukhtalif al-hadith. This is referred to as mukhtalif al-hadith. That means to say, look, the one hadith says the Prophet ﷺ said it is sunnah to stand and drink. The other hadith says, the Prophet ﷺ stands and drinks. The other hadith says the Prophet ﷺ says you must sit and drink. So how do we reconcile that? Is the one abrogated? Do you just jump and say, well, maybe this one is abrogated and khalas, we move on? Or do you just say, well, I don't like this hadith, so let's reject it? No, look, if they are of similar strength, then you can't just make any solution that you feel. You have to follow the procedure. So the first step is jama'. How do we make both work? How do we understand that both are applicable? Well, the scholars have said that the sunnah is that the Prophet ﷺ said you must sit and drink. So how do you explain the fact that he stood and drank? The standing and drinking of the Prophet ﷺ demonstrates that it is not haram to stand and drink, but rather he is just demonstrating that while it is permissible, it is makruh. So the Prophet ﷺ did it in order to establish for us that it is makruh, although still permissible. If he never did that and he strictly prohibited the standing and drinking, and he only sat and drank, and there was no evidence to indicate that he ever stood and drank, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then the ruling might have been that it is fard to sit and drink, and it is haram to stand and drink. Do you understand how that works? So that is an example of reconciliation or jam', how to make both or all of the evidence work simultaneously. The second is abrogation, right? Which is to act on the later hadith and not on the earlier hadith. And this divides our contradiction into nasikh and mansukh. Nasikh being the abrogator, the final word, and mansukh being the abrogated, the previous word. An example of this we already came across in our earlier lessons, where we said that initially the Prophet ﷺ prohibited the Sahaba from writing down anything but the Quran from the Prophet ﷺ. لا تكتبوا عني غير القرآن ومن يكتب عني غير القرآن فليمحه. Do not write down from me except the Quran. Whoever wrote down from me anything but the Quran should erase it. They should take it away. Why did he say that, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? We've explained that in our earlier lessons. If you've missed that, then do make sure you register for the course so that you can have access to those earlier lessons bi'idhnillah ta'ala, and that will be of great benefit. But you have that, and then you have permission given by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you also have the Prophet alaihi wasallam, like in the hadith of Abu Shah, specifically stating Uktubu li Abi Shah. Write down for Abu Shah. So this is a serious contradiction. The one hadith from Sahih Muslim of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, he says, do not write down except the Quran. And in the other hadith, he says, write down for Abu Shah, and he's not referring to Quran, he's referring to an incident at Fathu Makkah, wherein he's giving certain rules about Makkatul Mukarramah. So how do you reconcile that? Is it possible that you mustn't write and you must write at the same time? So no, reconciliation is not possible. Even though some scholars had given some form of reconciliation there. Naskh requires a date. It requires evidence of a date. Do we have any evidence of a date? Yes, we do. The incident of Abu Shah was at Fathu Makkah, which was in the 8th year after the Hijrah, which is very close to the end of the life of Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in this dunya. So based on this, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, as we saw in our previous lessons, he is of the opinion that this is clear evidence that the writing of hadith, or the permission and the command to write the words of the Prophet ﷺ was the final word, and therefore the nasikh, and the earlier instruction to not write, or the earlier prohibition to not write, that is the mansukh, the abrogated, and Allah knows best. If, however, you are in a situation where there's contradictory evidence, you cannot reconcile that, and you cannot make naskh, what then? You proceed to the next phase, which is tarjih, or preponderance, wherein you act upon the hadith that has more weight. What does that mean? This is based on circumstantial evidence. There's various reasons for why a scholar would give more weight to the one hadith than the other. Many, many reasons. So that which is given preponderance is the rajih, and that which is not chosen is the marjuh. And here, of course, scholars are going to differ. Some scholars would prefer one, and other scholars would prefer another. If that is not possible, which again I state is very, very rare, if it at all happened, Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. Of course it must have, because it's in theory, so it must be there in practice as well. But if you cannot possibly choose one over the other, then this is when the scholars proceed to make tawaqquf, or to suspend judgment, to not act on either. I should actually go and find some practical examples of tawaqquf in this instance to demonstrate. And if we are going to find them anyway, then you are probably going to find them in the works that have specifically been written about mukhtalif al-hadith. Entire works dedicated only to this topic. Ikhtilaf al-Hadith by Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala today forms part of Kitab al-Umm. Right? It's printed as part of Kitab al-Umm. That's one example of a work dedicated to this concept. Probably the most popular, the most renowned work in this regard is Imam Ibn Qutayba's Ta'wil Mukhtalif al-Hadith, in which he deals with only this concept and presents us with very, very interesting and beneficial knowledge about this issue. And then finally you have Mushkilul Athar by Imam al-Tahawi, where you can also find this particular issue unpacked. What I've also done in this slide, or in these slides, is to provide you with Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's sharh of the Nukhba, which is the Nuzhatun Nazar, and just to give you his commentary on that, so you can see it is in line with what we were saying, and you are free to read that at your own time and leisure, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, but I just added it in there for your benefit. So now we've covered hadith classification in terms of acceptability and rejection, and we've looked at the various types of acceptable ahadith. The muhkam is your undisputed hadith. There you have sahih li dhatihi, sahih li ghayrihi, hasan li dhatihi, hasan li ghayrihi, and we've covered that before. Then, if there are contradictions between a hadith of disparate authenticity levels, then the categories we dealt with earlier on, which are munkar and ma'roof and shadh and mahfuz. Those are the categories that would apply then. And if you are dealing with differences or contradictions within similar strength ahadith, then you would proceed to the formulae of either making jam', which would be mukhtalif al-hadith, that's the term that you use there, or you would resort to naskh, which is over there, and that would give you nasikh and mansukh, or you would, the scholars would make tarjih, or they would make tawaqquf, which is the final steps in the reconciliation process. Now that we've covered that, what remains for our upcoming classes is to look at the mardud or the rejected forms of a hadith. Why would a hadith be rejected? It's either going to be rejected because of at-ta'nu fi rawi, a problem with the transmitter, or inqita', missing links in the transmission. Those are essentially going to be the issues for which we will reject the hadith. Shadh and ilal we somewhat deal with separately. We've already dealt a bit with shadh now, but we will do so again later on. What would be a problem in the rawi? Either he lacks integrity, adamul adala, or he lacks precision, adamul dabt. So to demonstrate where we are at, once again we look at the shajara at-tawdihiyya li anwa' al-hadith, and we see that we've now covered this section over here, we've covered this section over here, and we've covered this section over here, right, of maqbool. We've also covered bi'atibari darajatihi over there. Now, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, in the next lesson, we will start looking at the mardud forms. And as I said, it's either going to be at-ta'n fi rawi, a problem with the transmitter, or as-saqat fi sanad, inqita' fi sanad, a missing link in the transmission. And each form of this is going to be a different category. Again, you have to memorize these concepts in order to stick with the program and actually not become lost. The more we go on, if you don't, keep up with it, then the next lesson you'll be more lost than the previous lesson. Now that isn't something that you should fret over if you already feel a bit overwhelmed. Don't worry about it. Just read over the few lessons. I mean, this is lesson number 10. So it's literally 10 lessons content that you need to go through a couple of times, and inshallah ta'ala, you'll master it within no time. What's more important than, the specific terminologies is the understanding of the concepts and being able to really understand the conversation of the muhaddith. What is he trying to tell me? What information is he trying to convey? That's the objective. So alhamdulillah, in this lesson, we have covered hadith classification based on contradictory evidence and acceptability or rejection of hadith. Sorry, contradictory evidence. That acceptability shouldn't be there. The next point that we looked at was hadith classification in terms of acceptability and rejection. And then finally, we looked at synthesizing contradictory evidence. So on that note, I leave you with the option to proceed towards the quiz, the multiple choice quiz, to ensure that you've understood the content of the lesson, inshallah ta'ala. And I trust that you will take the time to commit the terminologies to memory. Until next time, jazakumullahu khairan for joining me. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad, subhanallahi wa bihamdi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.